Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about step by step, so let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, what are the step-by-step procedures for creating web applications from scratch to a complete launched product? Alright, let's cover the standard setup for when I create a let's just walk through how I usually set up a corporate enterprise level team, if that makes sense. We'll skip all the necessary security infrastructure because basically if you're doing in a corporation it becomes a little bit more difficult usually because you usually have a lot of third-party systems, access control, different networks that you're dealing with, and you have like firewalls and like all of this good stuff. But the basics is, in essence, you create if you're going to do this for a team, first things first, you create a repository on some type of version control system, GitHub for example. Then you push some type of initial commit. Usually it's something very simple. You create this hello world application server. If it's a front-end project or a back-end project, doesn't really matter. There's more tooling involved. So let's say it's a back-end project. Well, then the hello world API is fairly simple. You establish a server in some programming language. Doesn't matter which one you have. You create a build script for it so that you can basically compile or run, depending on if you're using a scripting language or a compile language. And then depending now again if the way you're going to deploy things, if it's going to run on a VM or something like that, usually people are using Docker these days, so you create a Docker file of some sort. And so when the pipeline script in GitHub Actions, for example, runs, it's going to take care of running like unit testing, running like linting and checking and things like that, and then building your application into a buildable well, we call them artifacts, but depending on your lingo, that's going to then be pulled into the Docker container that's going to be built, and then it's going to be deployed to wherever you store your Docker containers. Usually that's in some type of cloud solution or a closed container repo of some sort. And that brings us to cloud providers or providers, because the deployment is a little bit different depending on who's doing your hosting. So if you have a host such as, say, Amazon or GCP or Azure or something like that, you basically need to create your own account, like your resource account where you're going to spin up your different services. And then either depending on how big it's going to be, either you use some type of off-the-shelf solution that might be something like Heroku as an example. That's a fairly simple one where you basically create the repository, you just connect your repository to Heroku, and then the Docker container and all the Docker file and so forth is basically handled for you. You don't have to do much more. If it's Amazon, GCP or Azure or something like that, you're going to have to do a little bit more work, where you might have to wire up your account, which, as I said, like if you want to push your Docker container to like their code repository, you're going to have to do some manual work. There's a few guides for how to do that if you wanted to. Anywho, basically when you get to this state, you now have the ability to push your code to GitHub. That's going to run some GitHub Actions, build your artifact, or so forth and so forth. And there's quite a few integrations for webhooks where you can basically deploy your built container to wherever that's stored. Right now you're in the first part of it is done. Now you have the ability to containerize or create an artifact that can be run in some type of production environment. Now comes the second part, which is deployment into a production environment, where now you need to have a domain of some sort where you can run the code. You don't always have to, let's assume that you don't register like a custom domain name or something like that, because you don't necessarily have to do that. All you really need is a box to run this thing on, and usually you're going to run that on a VM of some sort or in a Kubernetes cluster or something like that, which each of these different cloud services have, and they're all slightly different, so you have to configure that. But usually the minimum requirement is, as I said, you need to have an account on one of the providers' side, and if it's like Heroku or some similar handler sort of service, you don't do this. It's actually just taken care of for you. You just have to follow whatever specific guide it's about. And once that's done, they will pull that container that you created and put that in a running application somewhere. And usually they expose some type of, by default domain that you can use, and then that's basically how you access your application from the internet. Now, this will differ wildly in terms of how complex it gets, depending on, if it's a really large corporation. Usually you have quite a lot of other things that you need to consider here, where you might have logging, you might have telemetrics, you might have like different types of storage systems, like your databases, things like that. You might have, as I said, firewalls. You might have custom domains and subnets and so forth. Like, it really comes down to like how big is this system going to be. If the thing that I described for you now is basically how practically every small new product starts. Like, it's that simple, because now you are in a state where you can get code from a laptop in your code repository all the way up to a production release into somewhere where you can host the thing, right? So this is the bare minimum usually. And then usually when you set up the team, you have some type of Kanban board or something like that where you can declare your work tasks and prepare work, which is usually done in something like Jira or Confluence or so forth and so forth. So what I want you to take away from this is that the step-by-step procedure for creating programs from scratch and then completing a launch to production is: number one, create a code repository on some type of version control system or code repo hosting solution, like say GitHub. Create a web application, whatever it's supposed to be doing. Usually a Hello World application is fairly simple to start off with, because then you can build upon it afterwards. Create a build script for that so that it can actually run as a program on either a web server, or as a single process it might have an embedded web server, depends on which language and stack you're using. And then put that either in a container or some script that just builds the artifact, and so whatever is going to run it can run it. And then you need somewhere to store that artifact. Usually that's going to be either a container repo or some place like a blob storage if you're using zip, if you're just like storing zip files or something like that. And then you set up a hosting service of some sort. If it might be like one of the smaller providers or one of the really big ones. It depends on what your setup's going to be like. And then you need to decide basically how are you going to run the thing. Is it going to run on something like Kubernetes, or are you just going to use plain old VMs? Depends which one you're picking, but basically you're going to have to spin up some resources at the very least, and you're going to have to wire that up to some type of DNS. Usually if you spin up like an EC2 instance in Amazon, for example, you get like that for free. So now all you really need to know is how to actually get your code onto that app, to that computer, and it really depends on like how you want to do it. But usually there are webhook integrations that you can put up for things where you can actually pull the code or push the code, depending on when you run your pipelines in say GitHub Actions or something like that. And then that basically means that now when you push code, the code will go into your application, and you can access it through the DNS that has been provided. And there's a million other things that you could need to be able to do, but that would be the bare minimum, I would say, in order to basically have a functioning workflow for a software team. And then you usually have some way of tracking stories and things like that. I would say that this is the bare minimum, extremely simplified. Have a great day.